Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a really massive moment in history, the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. We're going to see how the end of one conflict created a completely new and honestly pretty difficult world for First Nations in North America. Let's dive right in. So, think about this for a second. What happens when a war ends, but not everyone actually agrees on who won? In the mid-1700s, the British defeated the French in North America. And well, the British thought they had won the whole shebang. But the First Nations? They had lived on this land for generations. They had fought alongside both the French and the British to protect their own homes, and suddenly they were facing a massive change. They absolutely did not see themselves as a conquered people. Here is our step-by-step roadmap for today. First, a sudden big change in leadership. Second, broken promises. Third, how Chief Pontiac fights back. Fourth, the new rules for peace. And finally, why all of this still matters today. Okay, Section 1. A sudden big change. There was a stark night and day difference between how the French and the British handled things. Before the war ended, the French treated First Nations as partners, building alliances through gifts of peace. It was about respect. But then, the new British leader, Jeffery Amherst, steps in. He totally stops giving gifts, basically calling it bribery. He limits trade, he stops paying fair prices. And worst of all, the British just start bringing in soldiers and settlers, completely threatening the First Nations way of life. It was a total flip in the rules. That brings us to Section 2, broken promises. Now, in 1763, that same British leader, Jeffery Amherst, wrote a letter that is just shocking. He used the word extirpate, which is an old word that means to completely destroy or wipe out. To put his plan into plain modern English, Amherst was literally suggesting his soldiers give First Nations people blankets infected with smallpox, a deadly disease. He wanted to use sickness as a weapon to destroy them. It's awful, but it brilliantly illustrates just how terrible the relationship had become and exactly why First Nations felt their very survival was on the line. Moving to Section 3, Pontiac fights back. Chief Pontiac of the Odawa Nation was a commanding, powerful leader. He wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen. In 1762, he called a highly secret council meeting right on his territory. He brought together the Odawa, Ojibwe, Wyandot, and Potawatomi nations. They all sat down to hash out a plan to attack the British. But here's the tricky part. How do you safely communicate a top-secret battle plan to other groups who live really far away? Well, they use something called wampum. Wampum are these special beads made out of shells. Now, sometimes they were used as money, sure, but their most important job was being beaded together on strings or belts to record messages. Think of it kind of like a very important physical text message. By 1763, secret war messages were traveling miles and miles across the land as wampum war belts, uniting all these different nations together for one common cause. And this was Chief Pontiac's message to his allies. He pointed out the cold, hard facts. The British were charging twice as much for goods, they refused to help the sick, and they honestly just laughed at them. So the core of his argument was just simple logic. He basically said, look, the British are actively trying to ruin us. If we want to survive, we have to unite and fight back. And they definitely fought back, launching coordinated surprise attacks on multiple British forts. Actually, let's look at one of their most brilliant real-life strategies. This happened at Fort Michilimackinac. Step 1. Hundreds of First Nations men gathered outside the British fort for a huge game of bagataway. That's a ball and stick game that's a lot like modern lacrosse. The British soldiers were totally used to seeing this, so they just kicked back, smiled, and watched the game. Step 2. The game was the perfect distraction. Step 3. While the British were completely glued to the sport, the players suddenly dropped their sticks, grabbed their hidden weapons, and successfully took over the fort. Just a really, really clever plan. Which leads us to Section 4. New rules for peace. After all these attacks, the British realized they desperately needed to make peace, so their government decided to issue a Royal Proclamation. A proclamation is just a super official announcement or declaration. Basically, the British king was about to lay down some brand new rules for how everyone was going to share North America. So they print this huge document, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, to officially announce they were taking over the government of Quebec. But here is the crucial part. This document also explicitly reserved giant areas of land strictly for First Nations. It was a written promise that they would have the right to hunt and fish on their own lands without settlers bothering them. Let's connect the dots on a quick timeline to see how fast this all happened. In 1763, the 7 Years' War ends.
Almost immediately, Pontiac's rebellion kicks off because the British were treating the First Nations so poorly. That rebellion forces the British to panic and offer peace with the Royal Proclamation. And that directly leads to the very next year, 1764, where a massive peace agreement is signed. We call it the Treaty of Niagara.
The 1764 Treaty of Niagara Wampum Belt is an incredibly beautiful and intricate piece of history. Remember earlier when we talked about wampum belts recording messages? Well, for this treaty, over 2,000 people representing 24 First Nations met up with the British. They agreed to peace, and the British promised, on the record, to keep settlers out of the Ohio Valley. This specific belt was created to perfectly preserve those promises of peace and friendship. It became known as the Great Peace of 1764. Finally, Section 5, Why It Matters Today. You might be wondering, why should we care about this today? Well, the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara aren't just dusty old pieces of paper locked in a museum. A lot of people consider them to be Canada's very first constitutional documents. That means they are the actual, living, legal foundation that guarantees Aboriginal rights today. When the Government of Canada sits down to negotiate with First Nations right now, today, they literally still rely on the rules and promises made in these exact documents. And because those promises are still active, people today stand up to fiercely protect them. Take 2012, for example. A huge movement called Idle No More sparked massive protests all across Canada. And the main goal of those modern protests? It was specifically to remind everyday Canadians about the agreements that were made back in the 1700s. They marched to make sure those centuries-old promises are still respected and that Aboriginal rights are protected today. So I want to leave you with one final, pretty important question to think about. If these peace agreements, like the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara, were made hundreds of years ago, how can we make sure those promises are actually still kept today? History isn't just a bunch of dates in the past. It's a living promise that we carry right now. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep asking great questions and keep on learning.